Hello makers, Ruth here. In this video, we're going to be talking about an alternative way to create a screen for the screen printing process. In the last video, we created a temporary screen by using a transparency sheet for our image. In this video, we're going to talk about using Mod Podge to create a filler instead of using that transparency sheet. Now with the transparency sheet, we had to think in simplified silhouettes. With this Mod Podge, we can be more complex with our design. So my example here, I have a little bee that I drew on my screen. I made my permanent screen, so I was able to pull several prints with my more complex design. Now today, we don't have to do that complex design. I'm going to do something a little more simplified, but we are going to walk through the process of how to make that permanent, that more permanent screen. So let me get these out of the way. Let's talk a little bit about supplies. So the first supply is going to be the illustrated instruction, and this is found on our resource page. It's the permanent hoop for screen print pouch. At the top, we have our list of supplies. I'm going over that right now, and then we'll walk through that process step by step. Now, one thing I do want to mention, because we're working with the Mod Podge as our filler, it's going to take a lot of waiting time because we need that Mod Podge to dry, and we need about 2 layers, maybe 2 layers of the Mod Podge. But once you let that Mod Podge dry and you have that image, you can use it over and over again. You can clean it in the sink with soap and water. That little bee that I showed earlier, I've been using that for several years now, and I can still use it. So it lasts a while. But the one little caveat is that it does take a little drying time. So know that this is not something that you can print with right away. But we're going to walk through that process together. Now, the illustrated instructions are helpful because you can take notes and reference back to the process. So go ahead and pull those out if you have them. We'll be following along with that today. The next supplies that we need are going to be our screen. And so for our screen, we're going to be using that small embroidery hoop and that nylon netting. And the nylon netting is basically pantyhose material. It's a really stretchy surface that has really fine holes in it. It's like a mesh screen. So we're going to be using that to create our screen. We also need from our kit, we're going to need our acrylic paint. We're going to use that to create our print. In your kit, it comes with different shades and 2 brushes, a wide flat brush and a small round brush. We're going to be using that wide flat brush today. The next thing we need out of our kit is going to be the Mod Podge and the silver handle brush. As I said before, this is going to be that screen filler. And so we're going to be using a couple layers of this today. These are our main supplies. So go ahead and pull out that Mod Podge. Now we'll also need excuse me. Now we'll also need our zipper pouch. This is going to be the main thing that we're printing on today. I will say our zipper pouch is a thin material, thin woven material. So if you have an extra piece of foil or piece of paper, go ahead and slide it in between those layers. We're going to be doing this so that paint, when we print, only stays on the front and doesn't transfer to the back. So again, if you have an extra sheet of foil or a scrap piece of paper, go ahead and slide that in between those layers. Now, there are a couple things that we need that are not in the kit. One of them is a pair of scissors. We're going to be trimming our netting. We'll also need a marker. I'll be using a Sharpie, but any type of highlighter or washable marker, that works as well. We're going to be using that to draw our design on our netting. We'll also need something that we can scrape the paint through. I'm going to be using scrap pieces of watercolor paper, but you can use cardboard, pieces of cardboard, or even an old gift card. It doesn't need to be big, just something that we can scrape through our surface. And then the last thing we need is going to be paper. We're going to do a test print to start, so scrap paper is good. But also if you have other paper that you want to print on, I have some scrapbooking paper here that I'm going to print on as well. So go ahead and pull those out. It's always good to do a test print before we print on our final piece. And if you've done printmaking before, you know that test print, it isn't always the prettiest print, but it does give us information. It lets us know if we need to use more paint or if we need to scrape it in a different way, add more pressure, all sorts of things. So that tester print is really important. But those are the supplies that we need for today. To start off, I'm going to pull out my illustrated instructions here. That first step is to create our screen. And so to do that, we need our embroidery hoop and our netting. So what we're going to do is take off that outer layer. Sorry, take off that outer ring. So we have our inside ring and our outside ring. And so with my inside ring, I'm just going to take my netting and lay it right on top of that inside ring. I'm going to take the outside ring and slide it right on. Now, this is going to be our screen. We want it to be pretty tight. And so as we tighten that outer ring, go ahead and pull some of that netting through so you get a really tight, a somewhat tight surface. So as I'm tightening it, I'm just kind of pulling that netting a little bit. Now, the truth is you're not going to get it tight all the way through just because of the nature of it. We're just going to try and get it as tight as we can. So screw it in as tight as possible and pull that netting through. You'll notice, I'm going to turn it this way, when I press my finger through, it gives it has a little give to it. That's okay. Like I said, we're not going to get it tight all the way through, but we want to get it as tight as we can. So as you're tightening that screw, just go ahead and try to pull that netting as much as you can, or as tight as you can. And then we have our screen here. So what I'm going to do is take my scissors and kind of trim those outside edges. This will get in the way as we do our printing, so it's good to go ahead and cut those off. And I'm just going around cutting it, not worrying about making a smooth cut, but just kind of cutting those edges off. Okay. So I've got a trim edge and I'll get rid of those scraps. And this is our screen. So when we go back to our illustrated instructions, after we make our screen, that next step is to draw our design in. And so I'm going to do, just like in the illustrated instructions, I'm going to do a heart. So to draw my design, I'm going to take my embroidery hoop, my screen, and I'm going to put it screen side down. So the netting is flat against my surface. There's no gap. That netting is touching the surface. And so what I'm going to do is take my marker. I'm going to draw on my netting. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind as we're drawing our design, our image, is that we want to make sure that our image is kind of centered in our screen. And we also want to make sure that we have a little bit of a gap in between our image and our hoop, right? So for example, I'm just going to take my marker and I'm going to draw a heart here. I'm going to do the heart today. So you can see I've got my heart drawn on. I'm also going to take a moment and draw a little heart on the inside. So I'm doing a little bit of a more complex design. So you can see I've got a little heart in the center and I've got that heart in the outside. For our next step, we're going to add that Mod Podge to kind of fill in the gaps. What that Mod Podge is going to do is it's going to block the paint from coming through. So what I'm going to do is add Mod Podge to my outside ring, and I'm going to add it to my inside heart here. Okay? So the part that I'm not putting Mod Podge on, I'm going to draw some lines here, just so it's easy to see. This will make more sense as we start painting. But I have right here, for my heart, I have two hearts that I've drawn. I'm going to put that screen filler, my Mod Podge, on the outside ring here to block the paint from going through. And I'm going to put it on my inside heart to block it go through. So the part that I'm not putting Mod Podge on, I've drawn some lines through just to help me remember how to space it or where that is. So our next step is to add the Mod Podge. And so what I'm going to do is open my Mod Podge up. And I'm going to pour, get that out of the way. I'm going to pour some of that Mod Podge in the cap. That takes a while because we're going to paint on it and we're going to let it dry. We're going to come back and check it because we don't want any holes where that Mod Podge is. So what does that look like? So I'm going to take my brush here and I'm just going to start by painting that Mod Podge. It may feel hard to do. I've got my netting flat against my foil, my work surface, and I'm one hand just holding that screen still and just kind of gently painting, basically painting with the Mod Podge. I'm painting that outside ring, and I'm painting it all the way up to that embroidery hoop. It doesn't have to be a super thick layer. We're going to paint a couple layers. So we're just really wanting to cover that outside surface. So I'm painting right up against my drawing of a heart. Taking my time with it. And again, painting all the way up to the embroidery hoop. One of the benefits of doing the transparency sheet is that you don't have to, and I'm not moving my screen. I'm leaving it right against the surface while I'm painting that Mod Podge on. But one of the benefits of using the transparency sheet instead of the Mod Podge is that you can do several different types of prints, several different transparencies for printing. When you're doing the Mod Podge, you can only use that one. There's no way to change it out, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you have an image that you really like and you want to print over and over again, like I have with my little bumblebee. So I'm just taking my time right now. I've got my netting flat against my foil, right? And I'm just painting that surface. I'm going to take some Mod Podge and I'm going to paint the inside of my heart, the little tiny heart that I had in the center. Just going to paint that. And you'll notice that the part I'm leaving out that I'm not painting is where I drew the lines. Everywhere that Mod Podge is, it's acting as a block. So that paint, when I scrape it through, is not going to go through that Mod Podge. So I'm going to leave it for a little bit, let it dry. It may take a while, but let it dry completely, and then we'll come back to it in a minute. So go ahead and pause the video, and we'll see you in a few minutes. All right, now that our screen has had time to dry, let's go ahead and get ready to do our second layer. So very carefully, I've let my screen stay flat against the surface of my foil until it dried. Now it's pretty dry, so I'm going to carefully lift it up. And look, I'm going to flip it over. So I'm looking at the top. And what I want to do is just make sure that there's no holes. If there are holes, it's okay. We just want to kind of fix it. So I'm going to take my Mod Podge again, and I'm going to do my second layer, but I'm going to paint it on the top now. So for the first layer, we had the screen side down, so the screen was flat against the surface. For our second layer, we're going to flip it over so that screen is up. It's not flat against the surface. There's a gap. So I'm going to open my Mod Podge up. I'm going to pour in some Mod Podge to my cap, and then take my silver handle brush again. And I'm just going to paint that second layer on top, going all the way to the hoop, the edge of the hoop. And the reason we're doing that is so it stays securely there. So I'm just painting that Mod Podge directly over the Mod Podge I already painted. I'm just kind of taking my time, filling in the space, making sure there are no holes. And that Mod Podge is acting like a screen filler. You know, I've talked often about how Mod Podge is like the magic art supply. You can use it as an adhesive, as a glue. You can use it as a sealant to protect a surface. You can use it to transfer images, and you can use it as a screen filler for screen printing. So there's so many wonderful uses to Mod Podge. It's a good supply to have in your art toolkit. Now I'm just kind of taking my time, making sure I'm getting close to the edges for my heart here. I want kind of a smooth edge, so I'm just going to take my time to kind of smooth out that Mod Podge along those edges. So I have a nice straight edge. And then for my complex design, I'm going to put a second layer of Mod Podge on that center heart. And what we're going to do is let that dry again. So we let it dry the first time. So go ahead and pause this video now and let your screen filler, your Mod Podge, dry for the second time. And we'll come back in just a little bit to start that printing process. So welcome back, everyone. Now that we've had time for our screen to dry, go ahead and take a look at my example here. You can see that the Mod Podge dried somewhat clear, but it's blocking that surface. Right? So when I put paint on it, it's not going to come through. That Mod Podge is blocking that paint. And so one of the things we want to check is we want to kind of look where that Mod Podge is, and we want to make sure that there are no holes. If you do find holes, you want to add a little bit more Mod Podge because you want that to be completely solid, right? And so I'm just checking to see my hole, and I can see that I have a little hole in my center heart here. So what I'm going to do is take my Mod Podge, add a little bit in my cap, and fill in that little center part. And then I'm going to let that dry. So pause the video again. Once that dries, we'll come back and start our printing process. Now that our screen has had time to dry, it's time to do our test print. Before we test, we want to just make sure again that every piece is dry and that there are no holes where the Mod Podge is. I'm going to start off by pulling out a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to do a test print. I'm going to do a red test print since we are doing a heart. That makes sense. So I'm going to take my screen and press it screen side down so the netting is flat against my surface. I'm going to take my flat brush and I'm going to add paint directly to that Mod Podge, the dried Mod Podge. So I've got a scoop of the paint. Don't want too much. So I've got the paint on top. What we're going to do now is with my scraper, now I'm using watercolor paper, but you can use a piece of cardboard or old gift card. One hand, I'm going to hold my screen still. With my other hand, I'm going to take my scraper and just scrape across my screen surface. Now again, this is our test print. We're doing it on paper. So I'm scraping it across my heart. I'm going to lift my screen straight up. And this is my test print. So what I can tell from my test print, it's not the most ideal, right? It's not the prettiest print, but it gives me some information. The first thing it lets me know is that my inside heart looks really good. My outside heart has some rough edges. So what I can do now that my screen is dry is I can wash it off. I'm going to wash the paint off and then add some more screen filler. So I've rinsed off my screen. You can see it rinses off nice and clean. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to come back to my reference here. This is my first print. And I can see that my inside edges are not smooth. It's okay, but if I want them to be smooth, one of the things I can do is go back to my screen here and add a little more Mod Podge. So I've got a thinner brush now that I'm going to use. You can still use the big Mod Podge brush, but to get finer lines, I've got an old brush here that I'm going to fill with the Mod Podge. and do smoother edges. So I'm just going to take my time. Doing a screen filler this way does take a little extra time, but this is a screen that you can use over and over again. So it's good to take your time in the beginning and get the edges the way you want them to be. Right, so I'm just kind of taking my time now, going through, noticing my edges, and smoothing those edges. It's good to do that after your test print because then you know exactly what's printing. Like I said, that test print isn't always the prettiest print, but it gives us a whole lot of information, helpful information. Lets us know where those rough edges might be that we can smooth out. And I'm going to kind of smooth out my inside heart as well. So while I'm adding that next layer of the Mod Podge, I'm just going to go ahead and straighten up, smooth out my inside heart. So now I've got those edges. Let me go fix this one. And you can see it takes like a couple tries, a couple layers to get it the way we want it. So after you do this last one, after your test print and you see where you need to edit, we're going to let it dry one more time. And after it dries, we should be good to print. So go ahead and pause the video again, let your piece dry, and we'll be back together in a little bit to do some more printing. So now that our last round of Mod Podge has dried, it's time to test our print again. So I'm going to take my screen, put it face down so the screen is lying flat against my paper, my test paper. I'm going to do red again. And with my paintbrush, I'm going to add some pigment to the Mod Podge area. With my scraper, I'm going to use one hand to hold the screen still. With my other hand, I'm going to scrape the pigment across. Okay. Do kind of a smooth scraping. And then very carefully lift straight up. And I have my heart. I have a smoother edge. I know part of it kind of jerked a little bit when I was lifting up because my paper wasn't laying flat, but I feel good about how my print looks. So I'm going to go ahead and start printing on my zipper pouch. So move this out of the way, bring in my zipper pouch. I'm going to take my screen, do it face down so the screen is lying flat against my zipper pouch. There's no gap. I'm going to add some more of the paint, and with my scraper, scrape it across. So one hand holding the screen still, with my other hand, I'm scraping that paint across, making sure I get a good coat of paint scrape across the whole surface of my print here. And then very carefully lift it straight up, and I have my print. It's a nice little heart that I have here that I've used my permanent screen. Now, cleaning and care. You can clean this with soap and water, wash it off as long as that Mod Podge is dry. You can wash it with soap and water, let it dry, and use it over again. You can change color. You can also take a little wet rag or wet wipe and wipe it off as well. If you find that you're getting a little smudging happening, again, just take that wet wipe and clean that up a little bit. Clean those edges. and then you can print again. So if I want to do another one, let's say I want to put another one right here, I can add some more paint, hold it in place with my scraper, scrape it across. Mm. We're not adding a whole lot of pressure, but we want to make sure that we're pushing that paint through. So when I pull my screen up, pull it straight up, I get another little heart. And that's how to make a mostly permanent, semi-permanent screen for your screen print. Happy printing, everyone. We'll see you soon.